dealing here with the Counter-Reformation, and this is the last video in this series of videos, and we're dealing with actually what the Council actually decided in relation to doctrine. It actually decided to, quite rigidly actually, in relation to doctrine, it actually decided to stand by the actual Christian principles that were going right back to the time of the Apostles in relation to Scripture alone, which became a doctrine of the Reformation movement, and Martin Luther was very strong on that in 1521. This is 24 years earlier, before Trent sat in 45. Martin Luther was very strong on the idea that he be said by nothing but Scripture alone, but as time went by he discovered that other people were also very strong in terms of their interpretation of Scripture, and he ran into difficulty with people like Zwingli by the end of the 20s in relation to the meaning of the Eucharist. And although actually Martin Luther never met John Calvin was a very famous theologian as well, but he emerged in the 1530s and the 1540s. He was born in actually 1509, so he was actually only a child when Martin Luther was putting up the actual 95 Theses in 1517, and he'd be a teenager at the time in the mid-20s when the Peasants' War and that took place, and Martin Luther wrote his book about a bondage of the will and total depravity and all that type of thing. But the church actually came down in relation to doctrine. It came down very strongly in relation to the traditional view of the church. It didn't go along with the faith alone concept. It didn't go along with the actual Scripture alone idea either that Luther was producing in the early 20s, because it was already beginning to show cracks in terms of various different disputes going on among the reformers themselves in relation to the Anabaptist movement in the mid-20s, and by the late 20s in relation to the dispute over the Eucharist at Marlborough Castle. And that went on into the 30s, and eventually, of course, by the mid-30s we had John Calvin, who wrote his famous book on Christianity, his understanding of it. He wrote that book in order to try and persuade the actual French king, Francis I, to recognise the reformers as not being a threat to the stability of the state and that type of thing. But actually Francis didn't actually go along with Calvin's analysis of Christianity, and he maintained the Catholic faith all his life actually. So we had these various disputes in France in the mid-30s, about the year by the year 1534. 34 is a very important year because it's the year that the placards were put up in various French cities by very strong radicals who wanted to actually denigrate the Mass and various things like that. Same year as Luther produced his Bible, or his reduced version of the Bible, in the sense that he regarded part of it as not Scripture, 7 books that didn't agree with the faith alone theology that he had actually developed a decade or so earlier. So the church actually rejected these things in terms of doctrine. They rejected the idea of Scripture alone, that the individual could actually interpret Scripture for themselves, and that was already proving to be the source of a lot of division. And of course in subsequent centuries it developed into far more division, with the Arminian movement towards the end of the actual 16th century and into the 17th century. You have this Arminian movement that split away from the actual Calvinist movement, who had a different view in terms of predestination and the various different doctrines that John Calvin developed, like limited atonement. And these ideas were based on a certain read of Scripture, certain texts that were taken out of context in a lot of cases. Of course, Calvinism basically was very strong for a few centuries, but actually eventually in America, of course, it collapsed in the situation where it no longer had states as it had in Europe to impose its doctrine, where people had their own capacity to make up their own mind on their own individual basis. They weren't forced to believe anything. In America, Calvinism sort of collapsed there because it was actually based on a very strict interpretation of the gospel, and very often an incorrect interpretation of the gospel as well. There's nothing in the there's nothing in the gospel, actually. Jesus never said that his death was actually only for a limited number of people. So that's all. It's a bit like Luther's faith alone doctrine. It's all based on a sort of a certain interpretation of a number of texts, but it doesn't take in the comprehensive overall view of the Christian faith going back to the time of the apostles. So Trent was very rigid in regard to a lot of these doctrines. They actually just basically said, not in line with the Christianity that goes back, that's rooted in the apostle tradition. So therefore they rejected a lot of these doctrines. And in regard to the actual Bible as well, of course, they actually said that the Bible that existed all the way through from the 4th century, when the church first discerned the Bible, the 73-book Bible, basically the church said no priest or no pope, no bishop, nobody else, nobody within the church has the right to interfere with the Bible. So they rejected Luther in regard to the canon of Scripture as well, and said that actually the actual 73-book Bible is the proper canon of Scripture, not 66-book Bible. Of course, Luther himself, as I said in a previous video, didn't actually reduce the Bible to 66 books. He simply downgraded a number of books, 7 books, that didn't agree with his theology, and it was later movements, Bible societies in America, printing decisions that actually caused the books to be dropped entirely. That's why there's only 66 books in many of the modern Bibles, but actually the full complete Bible is actually 73 books. And that's why, of course, people like Justin Peters and various different minority faiths in America, like for instance the Seventh-day Adventist. I was looking at a guy there a few nights ago actually on YouTube, Walter White is his name. They have sort of beliefs that are very much contrary to the actual Catholic tradition. And that's because they are actually reading from a distorted version of Christianity. It's actually a reduced Bible they're reading from. It's only 90% of the true Bible. And therefore they have a sort of a conflictual relationship with the Catholic Church, because they're reading from a different gospel. They're not reading from the actual true gospel that was handed on from the time of the apostles. And actually the Council of Trent was very firm in establishing this idea, like that the true gospel is the gospel that came from the apostles and was discerned by the church in the first couple of centuries. Now, on the other hand, Trent did actually manage to actually make significant changes in regard to the actual reform, the idea of reform, which simply means things take a different form or things need to change in a particular direction. So the actual Council of Trent did reform the church in regard to bishops. It said that a person can't be a bishop of 3 or 4 different dioceses. They can only be bishop in one diocese and do their job in that diocese. Make sure the actual clergy, the lower clergy, the priests and the actual deacons and people like that are properly educated and able to explain the faith. And with that, they brought about the principle of having a seminary or a priest teaching college in every diocese. That took years, decades, centuries to actually implement. But the basic principle was there, that the clergy needed to be properly educated. There was also guidelines about what they could and couldn't do. They couldn't be given bad example, or at least these are the guidelines. Of course, there was priests afterwards. There's always going to be a small minority that wouldn't be set by any guidelines, the 1 or 2%. But the guidelines are set down at Trent so that there'd be a minimise the idea of scandal, so as to strengthen the church and strengthen the faith. And also, of course, then there was the spiritual aspect of Trent, which was that various different spiritual movements, like for instance the Jesuits, who became a great global organisation in terms of education and missionary work all over the world, actually, especially in poor countries. That was set up actually before Trent by Ignatius of Loyola. He was a very important influence. He educated, the movement itself educated thousands of priests that went all over the world, spread the Catholic faith. So in a sense, like, Trent became a source of strength to the Catholic Church, in the sense that the crisis of the Reformation forced the Church to look inward at itself, to look at what it was doing wrong, and to actually change. And in that sense, this is what the Catholic Reformation is all about, or sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. There's also people like, of course, Teresa of Avila, who founded a movement of a convent of nuns. I can't think of which of them they are, but she is very important in terms of education, helping the poor as well. So the Catholic Church emerged as a more global, more powerful organisation in the aftermath of the Reformation. But unfortunately in Europe it caused as well a kind of a permanent split between the actual Catholic Church and the Reform movement, because throughout Europe there was various different wars over the following couple of centuries. A lot of these wars, of course, were based on politics, they were based on nationalistic type struggles, they were based on the fact that loyalty had been transferred from the Catholic Church to the Reform movement, and a lot of nobles, like for instance in England and places like that, King Henry VIII and people that came after them wanted to make sure to consolidate the actual gains by Reform type nobles, and therefore this caused a tremendous level of conflict in various countries around Europe. But the Catholic Church itself, from the springboard of Trent, became a stronger global organisation than ever before. So that's actually the summary of the overall impact of the Counter-Reformation as I understand it. And that's I'd just like to say thanks very much for watching these series of videos, and I hope it increased somebody's understanding of the impact of the Council of Trent, which is actually to a large extent still actually exists even to the present day. So in July I'll be looking at a different aspect of the Reformation, which is the actual conflict between Calvinists and Arminians, which is an interesting development in Christianity. So I hope to look at that in a week's time. Please subscribe if you'd like to see that, and thank you very much for watching for today.